Hello, my name's Mark, and you're listening to The Real Radical Progressive. In this episode, I'm going to be covering a topic that I really wanted to avoid, but I feel like I have to cover it, and I'm talking about the so-called social justice movement, or intersectional feminism, or whatever you want to call it. I really wanted to avoid this subject because it's just so toxic, but I feel like I have to address it, as I'm seeing more and more. Everybody on the left, all progressives are getting painted as social justice warriors, and we're not. I'm definitely politically on the left. I'm also a self-described progressive. I in no way, however, endorse identity politics or neo-Marxist movements of any kind. Much as a reasonable, although, and I stress in my opinion, wrong-headed person, it could be a libertarian or gasp neoconservative, and still in no way identify with fascism. I guess my point is that calling everyone on the left a special snowflake or an SJW or a pinko commie is just as ridiculous and more to the point, unproductive as calling everybody on the right a fascist warmonger. It doesn't foster conversation, and more often than not, it's factually incorrect. So I want to briefly run down the histories of the ideological left in this country, specifically the progressive movement, and compare and contrast it to the social justice movement, and also talk about how I think the left has gotten to where it is. So to begin with, let's just quickly recap what classical liberalism is. It's something I talked about in depth in my first episode, but I just think it's worth recapping quickly, because really I believe that everybody that isn't out on the political fringes will fit nicely into this camp. So briefly, to be a classical liberal, you, at least in principle, believe in the following three things. One is individual liberty, two, limited government, and three, in market-driven economies. So then you ask, what is progressivism? Well, loosely speaking, the progressive era, in America at least, started around the time of the first Roosevelt presidency, meaning Teddy, and ended with his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. So I want to focus on the accomplishments of these two presidencies. Teddy Roosevelt came into office at the end of the 19th century, a time when powerful trusts, we'd now call them corporations, more or less had a monopoly on all industry in this country. Roosevelt believed that Wall Street and the so-called industry titans were steering the country towards a revolution. The haves had it all, and the have-nots were hungry. It was a time when the extremely wealthy really did whatever they wanted. If docking pay helped the company's bottom line, then they did it. If you owned a railroad, the one whose construction was heavily subsidized by tax dollars, by the way, well, then why not raise the fares so high that the public could just barely afford it? It's not like they had any alternative. More than that, these so-called titans of industry thought themselves above and untouchable by their elected officials. As an aside, this is something that seems just eerily similar to where we are right now. Anyway, so using the Sherman Antitrust Act, which, though enacted in 1890, was really seen as a paper tiger before Roosevelt, Roosevelt broke up several of these trusts. Most notably, he broke up J.P. Morgan's monopoly on the railroads in the Northeast. This set the stage for a progressive era. Roosevelt's economic reform policies ran more or less as follows. As you see on the screen, diminish the power of trusts, but leave most intact, regulate private business, but not control it. And I guess the underlying assumption is that capitalism's benefits outweighs harmful effects, and that it's the government's job to minimize the latter. Franklin Roosevelt won his first presidential election during the Great Depression. What most conservatives won't give him any credit for is saving capitalism in America. It seems almost impossible to believe now, but, well, for instance, the IWW was a going concern at that point in our history. Much of the populace rightly saw that our capitalist market-driven economy was serving only the rich at the expense of everyone else. You got to remember that at this point in history, communism hadn't had the chance to prove itself to be the colossal failure that we all know it to be. All most people knew was that something had to change because the capitalist system had failed the vast majority of America. It was in this environment that FDR was able to convince the rich elite that they'd better start paying back into the system via income tax. That is, unless they wanted to see the rabble on the doorsteps with pitchforks and torches. So FDR used this newfound tax revenue to create several work and infrastructure projects in an overarching program he called the New Deal. The idea, of course, being to jumpstart the economy by putting people back to work. He also created the Social Security Administration so that even the poorest of us could hope to one day retire and still be able to eat. By and large, the progressive ideology is not in direct conflict with classic liberalism. Both ideologies embrace the core classic liberal tenets of individual liberty, limited government, and a market-driven economy. There is, of course, sometimes tension between the two, specifically at the intersection between individual rights and societal needs with regards to taxation and the regulation of the marketplace. But both classical liberalism and progressivism are in lockstep with regards to the critical importance of individual liberty in general and freedom of speech in specific, which, unfortunately, brings us to the social justice movement. So let's do a brief recap on that movement's history and how the left got to where it is. To understand some of the ideological roots of the movement, you'd have to go back to Germany in the early 30s, to what's called the Frankfurt School. Probably the most prolific student of this school is a philosopher by the name of Jürgen Habermas. They developed a philosophy widely known as critical theory. They realized essentially that Marxism, for a variety of reasons, had failed. But they picked up some of Marx's core principles, along with Kant and several other philosophical schools of thought, as a way to look at society. I'm certainly not an expert or even a very well-read student of the philosophy of critical theory. And I don't want to pretend otherwise. But the important thing to know is that they looked at things like class through a lens that included history, race, politics, all to hopefully have a better understanding of why a given society looks the way it does. So we'll be coming back to critical theory and its misuse by the social justice movement shortly, but let's skip forward to 1964. When President Lyndon Baines Johnson signs the Civil Rights Bill, the Southern Democrats were livid. They held a 75-day filibuster in the Senate. It's unheard of. After the bill ultimately passed, the South, which had been solidly Democratic until then, switched over to the Republican Party, and by and large have remained solidly Republican to this day. This obviously had huge ramifications for the Democrats. However, while they did, in fact, lose the South, they picked up another chunk of the constituency that was of increasing import: the minority vote. Many minorities, blacks in specific, had up until that point voted predominantly Republican for a variety of reasons. It was, after all, Lincoln, a Republican, that was responsible for ending slavery, whereas before the Civil Rights Act, the Democratic Party had been the party that supported segregation. In fact, President Wilson, a Democratic president from the early 20th century, actually during the Progressive Era, who was generally a forward-thinking progressive, was anything but when it came to race. Government facilities in Washington had long been desegregated, allowing blacks to hold federal jobs alongside their white co-workers. That is until Wilson took office. One of his first acts as president was to resegregate those facilities, not only setting civil rights back, but also denying blacks those employment opportunities. So obviously the effects of the Civil Rights Act on the modern political landscape cannot be overstated. This is the same era, by the way, in which second-wave feminism got its start. And from the beginning, the feminist movement and the civil rights movement were more or less joined at the hip. And before we go on, I must state for the record that I am not an anti-feminist, depending on what you mean by feminism. See, I'm old enough, although just barely, to remember how normal sexism was in our society. Moreover, I've heard the stories from my mother and women of her generation about just exactly how sexist things were. It wasn't all that long ago that it was considered perfectly normal to not hire a woman for a given job, not based on her qualifications or lack thereof, but simply because she was a woman. As an example, an anecdotal one, a friend of mine's mother told me about not being allowed to work in the computer lab at her university because the professor didn't think women were smart enough. Which is funny because she went on and retired, actually, as a regional sysadmin for a major government agency, and she was quite brilliant at it. So The feminist movement came along, in my opinion anyway, as a response to very real issues in society. Of course, women should be afforded the same rights as everybody else. Of course, a woman working the same job with the same expertise and performing at an equal level should be paid the same wage as her male counterparts. It's hard to believe now, looking back, that this was even an issue, but of course it was a real issue. The problem with saying that you're a feminist is that you could be saying that you believe in the egalitarian principles that I just discussed, or you could be saying that you buy into patriarchy theory and rape culture, etc., etc., etc. By way of example, this is Andrea Dworkin. She's considered a feminist scholar, and her work is to this day still core course material in university gender studies programs across the nation. She was a prolific writer, and if you Google her name, you'll see several quotes, like, quote, "Only when manhood is dead, and it will perish when ravaged femininity no longer sustains it. Only then will we know what it is to be free." Or, one of my favorites, quote, "I want to see a man beaten to a bloody pulp with a high heel shoved in his mouth, like an apple in the mouth of a pig," end quote. So, I gotta say, when I see central figures, and she's only one example, there's several prominent feminist authors with similar misandrous quotes, and by central, I do mean central to the feminism of academia. Anyway, when I see things like that, it's really hard to accept that at least some portion of the movement as a whole isn't, to some extent, about the hatred of men. So, why am I talking about feminism? Well, I'm talking about feminism because to a great degree, I think it's when feminism discovered critical theory, or cultural Marxism as some people would coin the feminist adoption of it, that we start to really see the rise of this toxic, radical social justice movement. So, to understand the modern feminist or third-wave feminist ideology is actually relatively simple. Simply take the Communist Manifesto and replace the word bourgeoisie with male and the word proletariat with female. And then, just like the re-education camps in Maoist China, teach these concepts to university students not as an interesting theory to be compared and contrasted with other theories, like you do in any other discipline. No, you teach it as fact, and you use it to indoctrinate. But then better still, because the same people that were teaching gender studies moved into ethnic studies. As I said, the feminist movement has been from the very beginning involved in the civil rights movement. They went on to create this concept of intersectionality. So now, with intersectionality, it's not just the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. It's not just men oppressing women. Now we have an endless hierarchy of oppression. White men, cisgendered white men, obviously being the oppressor of everybody. But everybody is, of course, the oppressor of everybody higher on the oppression hierarchy. And this is essentially the natural end state of identity politics. And this is where modern so-called third-wave feminism got critical theory dead wrong. So there is real value in looking at society through a critical theory lens. For instance, black people in this country as a group are way overrepresented at the very lowest end of the economic strata. Why is that? Well, without looking into our history and our politics and just understanding slavery and everything else that's going on in our history, you could come to one of a few rather ugly conclusions that are held by people on both extreme ends of the political spectrum. On the far right fringe, you'll hear something like, well, they're obviously genetically inferior. This coming from the white separatist idiots, right? Conversely, on the left, you might hear something like, it's institutional racism designed to keep brown bodies impoverished. As an aside, I haven't bothered to study why the social justice movement always refers to black and brown bodies as opposed to black and brown people, but I digress. These answers might seem reasonable to some people at first blush. However, the same fact kills both arguments. According to Wikipedia, the median white household income in America as of 2015 was $59,698, while the median black household income for the same period was $36,544. So that's it, right? Case closed. Looks pretty damning. One of these two theories might very well be correct. Either black people are just too dumb, or it's the patriarchy keeping black bodies impoverished. Except that households that identify as Nigerian, meaning they're either immigrants or first generation, had median household incomes of $62,086. So, using those two theories, either blacks are generally genetically inferior to whites, except for Nigerians who are, by the same logic, obviously superior, or the patriarchy is there to keep black bodies impoverished unless they happen to be Nigerian bodies, in which case the patriarchy actually works to their advantage. Or, as I believe, maybe something else is going on. My point is that the social justice movement has badly misused this tool. Using a critical theory lens can be very useful to figure out where a group is in society and how it got there. So in the former example, the black people who have emigrated to this country in the past couple of decades didn't have ancestors that suffered through slavery and the Jim Crow era, etc., etc. They're really just not of the same culture. What the social justice movement has missed is that demonstrably most, and note I said most, not all, but most of the race issues in this country are really not race issues so much as cultural issues. So aside from the movement's anti-liberal, anti-free speech orthodoxy, I have just two major concerns with identity politics. The first issue I have is that they're mistaking attributes for identity. The two groups I mentioned, the Nigerians and the American black households, are both black, but they don't share the same culture. And while it can be worthwhile to look at history using a critical theory lens, as it's a reasonable way to look at why groups of people are where they are in society, your race or your gender are no more your identity than your height is. I mean, it's certainly true that tall people are likely to have some similar lifetime experiences due to their height. Their height, however, is not who they are. It does not define them. It's just one of their attributes, and the same is true when it comes to any other attribute. And not to beat a dead horse around the bush, but think of these gentlemen: Adolf Hitler, Carrot Top, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Yogi Berra. So they're all white. They all have maleness in common, and as far as we know, they're all cisgendered, but that's really the end of the commonality. It would be pretty ridiculous to talk about their common identity. The second issue I have with the social justice movement, and this is really the big one because this is where things get really ugly, is that it's divisive. Realistically, we're just chimpanzees that can talk. And it's a really, really bad idea, especially if you're the minority, to make a big, huge deal about how you're not a part of the dominant culture. It creates in-group, out-group thinking, and just like chimpanzees, we will become tribal and violent. It's not that I'm anti-diversity, far from it. However, I really am anti-multiculturalism, as it always seems to end badly. I believe that if we're going to make this thing work, and we should all want to make it work, we need to strive to become one united culture. In a nutshell, that's where the social movement came from and my problems with it. But how do they manage to completely infiltrate the left? Well, again, I think there are two parts to this. The first thing you have to understand is that they don't start with the crazy. They will always start by saying things like, social justice is just about equal rights for everybody, or feminism is just about the belief that all women should be treated just like men. Well, okay, that's hard to argue. Who but, as Hillary called them, the deplorables, wouldn't be for equal rights. So yeah, give me some of that social justice. Sounds great. But then they start working their way into the movement. Then, when there's enough penetration, they start with small things, generally language policing. I'll say something like, well, as a good liberal, you shouldn't say illegals. You should call them undocumented workers. I guess it's not that big of a deal, and, if it'll keep the peace, sure, we can do it, but it never stops. As they get more and more power, they yell louder and louder about any perceived transgression. And really, my experience is that any attempt at honest debate is shut down immediately. Anyone who disagrees with them, no matter how slightly, is suddenly called a bigot, a racist, or a deplorable. As to how they took over the Democratic Party, that goes back to the Civil Rights Movement. Remember, as I said, the Democrats lost the South, but they picked up the minority vote. And the minority vote, that is the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, were in lockstep from the beginning. So the Democrats kept going back to that feminist minority well to win elections. And to be fair, at least through the late 70s or maybe even the early 80s, there was a lot of work to be done in terms of racial and gender equality. Then came the Reagan era, an era in which, for the first time, the middle class was constricting instead of growing. Deregulation was the word of the day. This was the time when we really, really needed a strong progressive voice to fight back against what I saw as an investor class revolution. The government not only allowed American corporations to outsource their production, but often they'd subsidize the move. Labor unions were being maligned and having their backs broken, and the Democrats were, by and large, still just going after the minority vote, even as the very middle class those minorities were hoping to become a part of was evaporating. Slowly, over time, as the Democratic Party, beginning in large part during the Clinton era, more or less abandoned the middle class, the core constituency they were left with was the minority and feminist movement. The strategy, I think, was to keep courting those groups to get elected and to keep their liberal cred, while in reality courting Wall Street and paying just a modicum of lip service to the progressives in their party. They had the tacit understanding that as a progressive, you really didn't have anywhere else to go. So, in a relatively short amount of time, the DNC voided itself of progressives, or at least any progressives that would actually stand up for the middle class and didn't also identify with the social justice movement. And, well, here we are. That's a relatively simplified version of what I see as the last 20 or so years in terms of the Democratic Party. I first became worried about the social justice movement a couple of years ago, to the point that some of my friends told me I was becoming obsessive, and maybe I was, but unfortunately my predictions came true. I remember telling everyone who would listen that if the left didn't get its act together and get back to an environment where we could really talk about difficult subjects, the very worst of the right was going to take over, and again, here we are. All of Donald Trump's answers with regards to difficult subjects like immigration are all pretty vapid as far as I can see. But he will at least talk about the issue. As for instance, I certainly have empathy for the poor Mexican laborer who just came here so he could put food on his family's table. I even understand, having spent a fair amount of time in Mexico, how just trite it is to say that they should just come here legally. I mean, look, the reality is if you're a poor, illiterate farmer living in Oaxaca, there isn't any way for you to legally immigrate. You don't have a passport. You don't have the money to get a passport. And even if somehow you did, you wouldn't know where to get one anyway. So, of course, my heart goes out to these people, and I want to help. On the flip side, a nation has the right, or really even the responsibility, to know who's coming in and out of their country. I mean, think about it. If we simply had open borders, immediately all of our civil services, paid for with our tax dollars, would be overrun by needy immigrants. And we'd find ourselves quickly in a race to the bottom. Instead of trying to find a way where everybody can somehow find a way to a better living standard. Amongst many issues, this one's really difficult to talk about, and it's nuanced. Unfortunately, nowadays, the minute you try to have a discussion like this on the left, you're screamed at and called a racist or a fascist or a deplorable, right? And that's the end of any conversation that can happen. We really need to get back to the progressive governance that created the incredible middle class of the 20th century. And the only way I think we can get there is with a unified culture and honest, frank dialogue. And I just don't see how that can happen with the social justice movement in charge. So that's the show. Thank you for tuning in. If you haven't already done it, please hit the subscribe button. And if you like the show, don't be afraid to hit that like button. Now, as always, this is Mark. I'm the Real Radical Progressive. And until next time, please take care and be well.